I'm back. Hey gang, welcome to part 2 of our temple build. In part 1 we painted the stone statue. If you haven't watched that video, you can get caught up by clicking here. Or you can click on the link in the description box below to watch all of the videos in this temple build series. If the stone statue is our main focal point of the temple, then this piece would be the podium upon which it stands. So let's get started on our tiered dais. I use a variation of Wylock's 1 1/4 inch grid system for my dungeon tiles. So to keep everything in scale with each other, I used the 1 1/4 inch measurements on this piece. If you haven't seen Wylock's case for a 1 1/4 inch grid video, I put a link to it in the description box below. So, if you are using a 1 1/4 inch grid system, here are the pieces that you will need. If you are using the standard 1 inch grid system, then these are the pieces that you will need. If you don't use a grid system in your games, then you can just use whatever size appeals to you. I'm going to be using tacky glue to assemble the tiers because it gives me more time to move the pieces around to make sure everything is centered properly than hot glue would. The first step is to glue the large foam board piece to the large cardboard piece. This is to help make the dais stronger than if it was all just made out of cardboard and had no rigid support. Since I'm using tacky glue, there will be some drying time as we assemble the tiers. To help keep the piece straight while it dries, I suggest using a good large book. Whether you're using a grid system or not, to give the dais the detailed pattern that I have, just follow the next steps. If you're using your own pattern, you can skip to Phase 4 texturing or Phase 7 painting by clicking on the timestamps in the description box below. I'm going to use the 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch piece as an example, but this pattern will be used on all of the tier pieces. The overview is that every tier piece will be divided into 1 1/4 inch grids. Those 1 1/4 inch grids will be divided in half vertically and horizontally. Then all of those 5/8 inch grids will be divided in half, or 5/16 of an inch, vertically and horizontally. The easiest way to achieve this is just to measure all of the tier pieces into 5/16 inch sections. If you're using the 1 inch grids, these sections will be 1 1/4 inch instead of 5/16 of an inch. You'll notice I didn't bother measuring the middle and bottom tiers in the areas where higher tiers will be glued. Using a hobby knife, we are going to score the grids. Don't cut all of the way through the foam board. Just cut deep enough to make grooves. As always, cut away from yourself for safety. And kids, don't use sharp objects without adult supervision. Now we will use the tacky glue to bond the medium tier to the bottom tier. And once again, use a good book to keep everything flat while it dries. Then glue the top piece to the middle piece. The drying time that I'm giving in between each tier is about 30 minutes. The glue can take up to 24 hours to actually cure, but 30 minutes will adhere the pieces together enough to allow you to work with the dais. And one more time? Just kidding. It's the book. Once all of the tiers are glued together, draw the grid lines on the sides of the tiers. The grids on the top tier should line up with the grids on the middle tier, and so on. It will look something like this when you're finished. Now for the hardest and most tedious part of this build. We're going to be making a brick pattern on the tiers. This is the pattern that you will have in each 1 1/4 inch section. And this is the pattern on a grander scale. You can see that after a while of drawing this pattern, your eyes may begin to deceive you. I found the best way to counteract that is to just simply use 2 different colored pens. Pick any corner of the dais and begin drawing the vertical lines. I've found that if you work in a diagonal pattern, you're less likely to miss a square. After you have that pattern done, you will notice that you have empty squares in 2 corners diagonal from each other, and the other 2 diagonal squares will have lines in them. Simply spin the dais so that one of the empty corners is in the same position as the corner you started in with the original lines. Start drawing vertical lines starting in the empty corner. Now your first set of vertical lines have become your horizontal lines. Again, working in diagonal lines will help you avoid missing any squares. And this should be the pattern you have when complete. Now, using a mechanical pencil with the lead in or a pen, just go through and widen the grids and brick patterns that we've drawn. Using a fine grit sandpaper, go across all 4 sides of each tier a few times. This will help give the tiers the look of wear and tear over the ages. Then take some tin foil or aluminum foil and ball it up. Run it over the tiers. It will leave an impression on the dais simulating a stone texture. Taking the 4 1/2-inch strips of cardboard that we cut while getting the pieces ready for this project, we will add height to the dais. Just run a bead of hot glue on the cardboard bottom of the dais and then lay one of the 1/2-inch pieces on it, making sure that it's flush with the bottom piece. If you have any ends that hang past the dais, just trim them off. Do this for all 4 sides. If the 4th piece is too long, just dry fit it, measure where it needs trimmed, and cut it. After all 4 sides have been glued in, just take some heavy construction paper or chipboard and glue it along the sides of the dais to help conceal the cardboard. Using a trick from Black Magic Craft, I'm using a mix of Modge Podge and black paint to base coat the dais. For more information on this mixture, I've put a link to Black Magic Craft's video in the description below. Applying the Modge Podge helps to make the foam board harder, sturdier, and more resistant to damage. The black paint in the Modge Podge serves 2 purposes. 1, it allows you to see where you've already applied the Modge Podge, and 2, it will settle in the cracks, bringing definition to our brick and grid pattern when we paint the dais. I apply this with a sturdy brush to help push the mix into the pattern if need be. I usually do all of my Modge Podge applications at the end of the day so the piece can dry overnight. For our first coat of paint, I'm using a Storm Cloud Gray, but any dark gray will work. I guess this is somewhere between a base coat and a dry brush. I don't want to apply it as heavy as I would a base coat because I want to leave some of the black in the grooves of the texture and in the pattern lines we've created. I'm shooting for an 80 to 90% coverage with this color. If you do get paint down in the pattern lines, don't worry too much about it. We'll take care of that a bit later. Next, I'm using a granite gray, but any gray will work as long as it's lighter than the first gray you used. If you don't have a large variation of grays at your disposal, you can always mix a few drops of white with a few drops of your first gray, mixing it and adding drops of white until you get a color that you are happy with. I'm going for a 60 to 70% coverage with this dry brush application. I'm just trying to pick out the higher areas of the project. If you're unsure what the dry brush technique is or how to use it, you can click on the link at the top of the screen. I will also leave a link to my dry brush video in the description box below. For the highlights, I'm using a pale gray. Again, as long as it's a lighter gray than your first two grays, it will work. I'm dabbing paint off of my brush before applying it. I'm not removing as much paint as I would for a dry brush, but I don't want to apply the paint in a heavy coat. I'm applying this paint along the very edges of each tier and putting a bit in the corners. I'm using a flat brush and just lightly running over the edges, pulling the brush towards the center of the project on each stroke. I hit the corners lightly after doing each edge so there is less paint on the brush. This highlight helps define the edges of the project. It also helps to accentuate the darker portions of the project, adding a bit of depth. When most of the paint is out of the brush, I drag the brush lightly across the project, just barely hitting some of the higher portions, again bringing more depth to the dais. This final step is optional, but if you lost a lot of your pattern detail during your painting steps, or you just want to add an old dirty look to your dais, I recommend looking into this option. The wash that I use is a mix of ink, water, and a flow aid that I make myself. I do not recommend trying to use washes you generally buy for miniature painting for terrain use, as that would just get way too expensive. I dip my brush into the wash and then dab it onto a paper towel. This helps keep the wash from pooling in places around the project. If you do get some pooling, just dab your brush onto your paper towel to get most of your wash out of the brush, then dip your brush into the areas where your wash has pooled. This will suck the wash back into the bristles and remove those pools from your project. Remember to get the wash into the grid lines and brick pattern of the project. Here is a picture of the dais completed, and a picture of it with the statue we did in part 1 and a miniature for scale. So there you have it, gang, my take on a tiered dais. Hopefully you found this video helpful and informative. While you're here, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments or questions in the belows. Thank you to all of my subscribers. If you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button and click on the little bell so that way you'll be notified when I post my next video. Most of all, thanks for sharing your time with me. As always, happy crafting and happy gaming. I'm Fear the Platypus, and this one is done.